September 1944. A converted army base outside Aliceville, Alabama. The dining hall doors swing open and 19-year-old Wehrmacht auxiliary Hannah Mueller smells something her mind cannot process. Bread, real bread, fresh, soft, white bread, baked that morning. The smell hits her before she even sees the food, and her knees nearly buckle. For 3 years on the Eastern Front, Hannah had eaten black ration bread so hard it had to be soaked in coffee before it could be chewed. She had watched comrades die for a single stolen loaf of rye. She had eaten boiled grass outside Kharkov. She had eaten things she refused to name, even inside her own thoughts. And now an American sergeant was pointing her toward a long wooden table where steam rose from platters piled with sliced beef, where butter sat in yellow blocks, glistening under the lights, where a small dish held white sugar, just sitting there, unguarded, free for anyone to take. Hannah turned to the woman beside her, an Africa Corps auxiliary named Wilhelmina Schneider, and whispered the only thing her shocked mind could form. "It's a trick." Schneider nodded grimly, never taking her eyes off the food. "They're fattening us up, like pigs before the slaughter." Behind them in line stood Clara Hoffman, a 24-year-old naval auxiliary pulled from the Atlantic 6 weeks earlier, and Carla Becker, an intelligence officer captured in Normandy who had been told by her own commanders that any soldier who fell into American hands would be executed within a week. None of them moved. None of them reached for a tray. They stood frozen in the doorway of a dining hall in Alabama, 4 women in shabby uniforms, staring at more food than they had seen at one time in years, and they were absolutely certain they were about to die. These 4 women did not know they were standing inside one of the most astonishing chapters in the history of the Second World War. They did not know that within 6 months they would be writing letters home that German censors would refuse to deliver, not because the letters contained military secrets, but because no one in starving wartime Germany would believe what they described. They did not know that the rumors whispered through their barracks at night, the rumors about American food being a torture more cruel than beatings, were both completely wrong and somehow completely right. They did not know that they were about to eat better as prisoners of war than they had eaten as free German civilians since 1939. The story of what happened inside America's 700 prisoner-of-war camps has been buried for 8 decades. Buried because it embarrassed propagandists on both sides. Buried because it did not fit the clean narrative of a brutal war. Buried because the truth was so strange that even the women who lived it sometimes doubted their own memories. But the documents have survived. The diaries have survived. The letters have survived. The women themselves left their testimonies before they died. And what they describe is one of the most extraordinary untold stories of the entire war. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you are about to learn was kept out of history books for a reason. If you love stories that schools never taught you, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell icon so you do not miss what comes next. A simple like helps this story reach more people who deserve to hear it. Now let me take you back to the night Hannah Mueller walked into that dining hall in Alabama, and to the moment she became absolutely convinced the Americans were about to kill her. To understand why a plate of food terrified a battle-hardened German auxiliary, you must first understand the world Hannah Mueller had been living in. By the autumn of 1944, the German army on the Eastern Front had been starving for 2.5 years, not hungry, starving. The official ration for a Wehrmacht soldier in combat conditions was supposed to be roughly 700 grams of bread, 150 grams of meat or cheese, and small amounts of fat, sugar, and ersatz coffee per day. On paper, it looked acceptable. In reality, by 1943, frontline units east of the Dnieper River were receiving perhaps a third of those amounts on a good week. Supply lines stretched 1,200 miles back to Germany, and partisans destroyed everything that moved on the railways. The official meat ration was often replaced by what soldiers called horse jam, a gray paste made from the bones and tendons of dead horses ground into a slurry. The bread was baked from rye flour stretched with sawdust filler, and the soldiers learned to chew slowly because biting too quickly would crack a tooth. Hannah had joined the Auxiliary Corps in March 1942, 18 years old, healthy, weighing 170 pounds. By December 1943, after one winter at Stalingrad's outer perimeter and a retreat through White Russia, she weighed 126. Her unit commander, an Austrian captain named Reinhardt, kept a notebook in which he listed the food his personnel had eaten during the worst weeks. The list, recovered after the war by American intelligence officers, makes for grim reading. Tree bark boiled in water with a single bouillon cube shared between 6 people, field mice caught in supply trenches, skinned with bayonets, roasted over candle stubs, cats from abandoned Russian villages, crows. Once, after a particularly brutal week in February 1944, a soldier in the 3rd Platoon ate the leather of her own belt, softening it for 3 days in melted snow before chewing it down to a digestible pulp. Hannah was there. Hannah watched. Hannah understood that this was now the normal world. The captain wrote in his notebook beside that entry, "The girl survived but cannot meet my eyes any longer. I think we have lost something today that we will never recover." The Wehrmacht itself, the institution that had marched across Europe with such confidence in 1939, was by 1944 a starving army held together by amphetamines and fear. Pervitin tablets, the methamphetamine pill that German pharmaceutical companies had distributed to soldiers since the Polish campaign, were now being passed out as a substitute for food. A woman on Pervitin did not feel hunger for 12 hours. A woman on Pervitin did not feel cold. A woman on Pervitin also developed psychosis, heart palpitations, and a tendency to fire her weapon at shadows, but the German High Command had decided these were acceptable trade-offs. This was the world inside Hannah Muller's body when she was captured outside Aachen on the 7th of September 1944. She had not eaten anything beyond ersatz coffee and a quarter loaf of sawdust bread in 4 days. She was 20 pounds underweight for her frame. Her gums bled when she brushed them. The skin on her hands had begun to split at the knuckles, a condition the medical corps called soldier's hand, and considered untreatable in field conditions. When American infantrymen of the 1st Division swept through the German trench line where Hannah was hiding, she did not even raise her rifle. She raised her hands. She raised them slowly because raising them quickly made her dizzy. The first American who reached her was a young corporal from Kentucky who looked at Hannah, looked at the rifle Hannah had dropped, looked at how thin Hannah's wrists were inside her uniform sleeves, and did something Hannah had been told no American would ever do. He pulled a Hershey bar from his pocket, broke it in half, and handed half of it to Hannah. Then he gestured for Hannah to walk. Hannah walked. She did not eat the chocolate. She clutched it in her fist for the next 11 hours because she was certain it was poisoned and that the moment she tasted it, the corporal would shoot her. This is what years of propaganda will do to a human mind. This is what Hannah Muller carried with her when she stepped through the doors of the Aliceville dining hall 5 weeks later. Now you know why a plate of beef and a block of butter looked, to her, like the most terrifying weapon she had ever faced. The terror that gripped Hannah and her fellow prisoners did not come from nowhere. It had been carefully manufactured by an entire industry of lies. And to understand the dining hall scene, you must understand what every German auxiliary had been told to expect from American captivity. From the moment Joseph Goebbels took control of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in 1933, the depiction of America had moved through several careful phases. In the early years, America was depicted as a clownish, racially confused republic of jazz and degeneracy. By 1942, after American troops began arriving in North Africa, the message hardened. Americans were now described in Wehrmacht briefings as a mongrel race of mercenaries, led by Jewish bankers, soldiers with no military honor who took prisoners only to torture them for amusement. A field manual issued to soldiers of Army Group Center in March 1943, a manual the United States Army would later capture and translate, instructed German troops to expect the following treatment if captured by American forces. They would be starved deliberately for the first 2 weeks to weaken their will to resist. They would be subjected to medical experiments by Jewish doctors brought from New York for the purpose. They would have their teeth removed by force so their corpses could not be identified. They would be made to perform sexual acts for the entertainment of soldiers. They would eventually be executed by hanging in a public square, and their bodies would be left to rot as a warning to the next group of prisoners. Soldiers were instructed to fight to the last bullet to avoid capture. They were issued small glass ampules of cyanide and told to bite down on them rather than surrender. They were shown films, week after week, in which actors in American uniforms beat and tortured actors in German uniforms. They were warned that even the food the Americans offered would be poisoned, or that it would contain drugs designed to make them confess military secrets, or that it would simply make them sick enough to die slowly while the Americans watched and laughed. Hannah Muller had sat through 23 of these films during her training in 1942. Wilhelmina Schneider had sat through 40 during her years with the Afrika Korps, including a particularly memorable film in which an American officer played by a German actor with a fake American accent forced a captured Luftwaffe pilot to eat ground glass mixed into mashed potatoes. Clara Hoffman, the naval auxiliary, had been told that American sailors threw German prisoners alive into the sea to be eaten by sharks, and that those who reached land were used as live targets for naval gunnery practice. Carla Becker, the intelligence officer, knew most of this material was lies. She had read intercepted Red Cross reports. She suspected the truth was more complicated. But even Becker, when she was captured in Normandy in July 1944, found herself shaking uncontrollably during her first interrogation by an American major from Boston. The propaganda had burrowed too deep. It was no longer something a woman believed, it was something a woman's body believed. This is why, when these women were finally loaded onto trains and ships and sent across the Atlantic to camps in the American interior, they spent every waking moment cataloging what they were sure were the early signs of a coming massacre. The water tasted too clean. That meant chemicals. The American guards were too relaxed. That meant they were not afraid because they knew their prisoners would soon be dead. The blankets they were given were too warm. That meant the Americans wanted the prisoners comfortable so they would not resist when the time came. And the food. Oh, the food. The food was the most suspicious thing of all, because the food was simply impossible. Real coffee served black, with sugar offered on the side. Eggs fried in butter, served on porcelain plates. Oatmeal with cream and brown sugar. Apples, whole apples, 1 per woman, sometimes 2. Bacon. Bacon. None of these women had tasted bacon in years. Some of the younger auxiliaries, the girls conscripted in 1944, had never tasted bacon at all in their conscious memory because rationing in Germany had begun before they were old enough to remember any other way of eating. The Americans put this food in front of them and walked away. No guards stood over them with rifles. No one watched them eat. The food was simply there, and the Germans, every single morning, sat at the long wooden tables in the dining hall and tried to figure out which item on the tray would be the one that killed them. But I am getting ahead of myself. Before the dining hall, there was the journey. And the journey itself was the first thing that began to crack the propaganda Hannah Muller had been fed her entire adult life. After her capture outside Aachen, Hannah was moved with several hundred other prisoners to a temporary holding facility behind American lines, a converted French chateau where the food was already strange. Stew. Real stew with chunks of meat. Bread that was soft. Coffee that was not made from acorns. Hannah ate cautiously, expecting the cramping pain that she had been told would announce the poison. The cramping did not come. After 3 days at the chateau, she and roughly 1,500 other German prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven to Le Havre, where a former passenger liner, now repainted in dazzle camouflage and converted to a troop transport, waited at the dock. The ship was called the SS Argentina, and Hannah climbed the gangplank in a column of other dazed and silent women, certain that she was now boarding the vessel on which most of them would be drowned. The voyage took 11 days. Hannah was assigned a hammock in what had once been the second-class lounge, a room that still had brass fittings and the faded outline of a dance band's bandstand against one wall. She shared the space with 60 other women, including Wilhelmina Schneider, who had been transferred from a camp in Italy after her health collapsed, and the British had decided she was a candidate for repatriation, then changed their minds and sent her to America instead. The two women became friends on the 3rd day at sea, when Schneider noticed Hannah was hiding her bread roll inside her uniform jacket rather than eating it. "What are you doing, girl?" "I am saving it." "Saving it for what?" "For when they stop feeding us. They will stop feeding us soon. I want to have something left." Schneider stared at the young auxiliary for a long moment. Then she said, "Hannah, the Americans are not going to stop feeding us. I do not think they know how to stop feeding us. Eat your bread." But Hannah did not eat it. She saved it. By the 7th day at sea, the bread roll had grown a beard of green mold, and Hannah wept quietly when an American sailor noticed it during a hammock inspection and threw it into the sea. The sailor, seeing the girl's tears, did something Hannah could not understand. He went to the galley, came back with 2 fresh rolls and an apple, pressed them into Hannah's hands, and said in broken German, "Eat, eat." Hannah did not eat them. She hid them in a different pocket. The sailor came back the next day to check, found the rolls, and replaced them again with fresh ones. This continued for the rest of the voyage, a strange, silent game that Hannah did not have the emotional capacity to understand at the time, but which she would later describe to her grandchildren as the moment she first began to suspect that everything she had been told about Americans was a lie. The ship docked in New York Harbor on the morning of the 3rd of October, 1944. The Germans were not allowed on deck for the docking because American authorities did not want German prisoners staring at the Statue of Liberty and the New York skyline, partly for security reasons and partly because someone in the War Department had concluded, correctly, that the sight would be psychologically devastating to women who had been told America was on the verge of military and economic collapse. But Hannah, peeking through a porthole in the second-class lounge while a guard's back was turned, saw enough. She saw Manhattan. She saw the buildings. She saw the lights. She saw the cars. She saw the people in suits walking on the docks, people who were not soldiers, people who looked well-fed and unhurried and absolutely unconcerned that there was a war happening somewhere on the other side of the ocean. Hannah turned to Schneider and said, in a voice so small it could barely be heard above the engine noise, "Wilhelmina, Wilhelmina, the war is lost. We have already lost the war, and no one in Germany knows it." Schneider, who had seen the lights of Cairo and Casablanca, and who understood economics better than the Hitler Youth had taught Hannah to understand it, simply nodded. "Yes, girl. We lost the war before we started it. We just have not been told yet." From New York, the prisoners were loaded onto trains. American passenger trains with proper seats, with windows that were not boarded up, with conductors who walked the aisles and pointed out features of the landscape as though the prisoners were tourists. Hannah watched the eastern seaboard of the United States slide past her window for 2 days and 3 nights, and what she saw broke something inside her that had been holding the propaganda together. There were no bombed cities. There were no ruins. There were no craters in the fields. There were towns with their lights on at night, lights on in October 1944, because America did not require blackouts, because no enemy aircraft could reach America. The factories she passed were intact, smokestacks pouring out the smoke of healthy industry, parking lots full of cars driven to work by people in clean coveralls. The fields were green and unbroken. The roads were paved. The schools had buses parked outside them. Children waved at the trains from front yards. Children waved at trains carrying German soldiers. And the children did not know they were enemies because the children did not need to know. The war was not in their country. The war would never be in their country. By the time the train crossed into Alabama on the morning of the 5th of October, Hannah Muller had not spoken for 19 hours. She was, for the first time in her life, beginning to understand what her country had decided to fight. Camp Aliceville sat on roughly 400 acres of Alabama pine country, about 30 miles southwest of Tuscaloosa. It had been built in 1942 by the Army Corps of Engineers, originally to hold 6,000 prisoners, but expanded by 1944 to hold close to 7,000. From the outside, it looked like every other American military installation. Barbed wire fencing in 2 parallel rings, guard towers at the corners, a main gate with 2 flagpoles flying the stars and stripes, and the regimental colors of the Guard Battalion. The Germans were unloaded from the trains, marched through the main gate, and processed in groups of 20. Their names were recorded. Their ranks were recorded. Their service numbers were recorded. They were each handed a printed pamphlet in German titled Rules and Regulations for Prisoners of War in the United States of America, a document that included references to specific articles of the 1929 Geneva Convention, and that promised, in formal legal language, that all prisoners would be fed at the same caloric standard as American soldiers, would be permitted to write home through the International Red Cross, would have access to medical care, would have access to religious services, and would, after the war, be returned home in accordance with international law. Carla Becker, the intelligence officer, read the pamphlet twice and then turned to the woman next to her, an Oberleutnant from a Panzer Support Division captured at Falaise, and said, "This is a remarkable forgery. It is so well done it almost looks real." The Oberleutnant nodded and said, "Of course it is a forgery. Do you really believe they intend to give us all of this?" Both women were wrong. The pamphlet was not a forgery. The pamphlet was a literal description of what was about to happen to them. And that is what made the next 24 hours so utterly devastating to their understanding of the world. Hannah, Wilhelmina, Clara, and Carla were marched to barracks number 47, a long, single-story wooden building with 20 cots arranged in 2 rows. Each cot had a mattress, a real mattress, not a sack of straw. Each cot had 2 blankets, folded military style at the foot. Each cot had a small wooden footlocker, and on top of each footlocker was a small leather pouch containing the following items, which an American sergeant listed off with a clipboard: 1 toothbrush, 1 tube of Colgate toothpaste, 1 bar of soap, Ivory brand, 1 small towel, 1 comb, 1 safety razor with 5 replacement blades, 1 small mirror, 1 package of cigarettes, Lucky Strike brand, 1 book of matches, 1 pencil, 1 small pad of paper for letter writing. The women stood in silence and stared at these objects. Hannah picked up the tube of toothpaste, turned it over, read the English label, and put it down with hands that had begun to shake. Wilhelmina picked up the bar of soap, smelled it, and put it down without saying anything. Clara opened the package of cigarettes, looked at the white-papered American cigarettes inside, and closed the package again as though afraid they might escape. Carla Becker, who spoke the best English of the 4, read the pamphlet a 3rd time, then a 4th time, then sat down on the edge of her cot and put her head in her hands. After a long silence, she looked up at the others and said something none of them would ever forget. "I think," she said quietly, I think they may not be planning to kill us." That was when the dinner bell rang. The dining hall at Camp Aliceville was a single large wooden building, painted white on the outside, with green trim around the windows. Inside, it could seat roughly 600 people at a time, arranged at long pine tables with benches on either side. There were 3 serving lines along one wall, manned that evening by American mess sergeants in white aprons over olive drab uniforms. The kitchen behind the serving lines was visible through a wide pass-through window, and the prisoners filing in for their first meal could see directly into it, could see the steel ovens, could see the cooks, could see the huge polished pots on the gas ranges, could see, hanging from hooks above the chopping block, 3 whole sides of beef being trimmed for the next day's rations. Hannah Muller stopped walking when she saw the beef. She simply stopped. A prisoner behind her bumped into her and grunted. Hannah did not move. She was staring at more meat than she had seen in any one place since the Harvest Festival in her Bavarian village in the autumn of 1938, when her grandfather had slaughtered a pig and the whole family had eaten themselves sick on roast pork and dumplings. Hannah was 6 years old in 1938. She had been hungry in some form every day of her life since. The serving line moved forward, and Hannah moved with it, carrying a metal tray of a kind she had never seen, divided into compartments. The first American mess sergeant, a heavy-set man with sergeant's stripes and a kind face, dropped 2 slices of roast beef onto the tray's largest compartment. Then he added a ladle of brown gravy. Then he moved the tray forward. The next sergeant added mashed potatoes, a generous scoop, with a small pat of butter melting on top. The next sergeant added a portion of green beans, cooked with bacon. The next added a thick slice of white bread, soft and fresh. The next added a small glass dish containing what Hannah, after a long moment of staring, identified as a pat of butter the size of her thumb. Real butter. Hannah had not seen real butter since 1941. The next sergeant added a metal cup of coffee, black and steaming. The final sergeant, at the end of the line, dropped onto a small dessert plate something Hannah had only ever seen in pictures in pre-war children's magazines. A scoop of vanilla ice cream. Hannah looked at the ice cream. The ice cream looked at Hannah. Hannah began to cry. She could not help it. She stood in the middle of the dining hall of Camp Aliceville, Alabama, holding a tray that contained more food than she had been given in any single day of the past 3 years, and she wept silently with the tray shaking in her hands. The American sergeant who had served her the ice cream noticed. The sergeant did something Hannah did not expect. He came around the end of the serving line, took Hannah gently by the elbow, and walked her to an empty seat at one of the long pine tables. He did not speak. He simply guided the young German to the bench, set her down, made sure the tray was placed properly in front of her, and then patted her once on the shoulder and walked away. Hannah sat at the table and stared at her food and could not move. Wilhelmina Schneider sat down across from Hannah a few minutes later, her own tray equally loaded. Clara Hoffman sat next to Wilhelmina. Carla Becker sat next to Hannah. None of them ate. They stared at their trays. They stared at each other. Around them, the dining hall filled up with 700 other German prisoners, most of them recent arrivals like themselves, and the room was strangely quiet because most of these women were doing the same thing. Sitting, staring, trying to understand. Wilhelmina spoke first. "We have to eat it." "Why?" Hannah whispered. "Because if we do not eat it, they will know we suspect, and they will become angry." This was the logic of a woman who had spent 3 years inside the Wehrmacht and could not imagine that food was simply food. Carla Becker, the intelligence officer, considered Wilhelmina's reasoning. "Or," she said slowly, "we eat it because they want us to eat it because they intend to fatten us up before transferring us somewhere else for execution." Clara nodded gravely. "Yes, that is also possible." Hannah looked at the ice cream. The ice cream was beginning to melt. "I don't care," she said. "I don't care anymore. If they are going to kill me, they are going to kill me. I am going to eat the ice cream first." And Hannah Muller, the girl from a Bavarian village who had not eaten ice cream in 7 years, picked up the small metal spoon that came with her tray and took the first bite. The dining hall around her went silent. The other 3 women at her table watched her as though she were defusing a bomb. Hannah put the spoon in her mouth. Her eyes closed. A tear rolled down her cheek. The ice cream was cold and sweet and creamy and impossible, and Hannah Muller in that moment understood that whatever the Americans were planning to do with her, she would face it with the taste of vanilla ice cream still on her tongue, and that this was somehow the most defiant thing she had ever done. She took another bite, then another. She ate the entire scoop of ice cream first, before she touched anything else on the tray. And when it was gone, she picked up her fork, looked across the table at Wilhelmina and said, "Eat, just eat. Whatever happens, happens." The dam broke after that. Wilhelmina picked up her fork. Clara picked up hers. Carla Becker, the intelligence officer who had been holding out longest, sighed deeply and picked up her bread, spread butter on it with a careful, slow motion as though performing a ritual, and took a bite. The bite made her close her eyes. She had not tasted real butter, melted into fresh white bread, since 1939. 5 years. 5 years of margarine made from coal tar derivatives, of bread baked with sawdust, of coffee made from roasted barley and chicory root. Carla Becker ate the slice of bread in 4 bites and then immediately raised her hand to a passing mess sergeant and asked, in careful English, "May I please have another piece?" The sergeant smiled, said, "Sure thing, buddy," and brought her 2. Carla Becker ate them both. Then she ate the roast beef. Then she ate the potatoes. Then she ate the green beans. Then she drank the coffee, which was real coffee, real Arabica coffee, and which made her sit very still for a long moment, because the smell alone was enough to break her heart. Around them, the other 300 German prisoners in the dining hall were doing the same thing. The room filled with the sound of forks against metal trays, of women eating, of the quiet, small noises of human beings who have been starving for years finally being given enough food. Some women ate slowly, savoring every bite. Some ate quickly, almost frantically, until a guard came over and gently put a hand on their shoulder and told them, through a translator, to slow down because their stomachs would not be able to handle it. Some women, like Hannah, ate while crying quietly and did not stop crying for the entire meal. The American guards stood at the edges of the room and watched, and the guards were not laughing. The guards were not amused. Many of the guards, people who had grown up during the Great Depression and who knew what real hunger looked like, had tears in their own eyes. Because the guards understood, perhaps better than the prisoners did, what they were watching. They were watching the moment a piece of Nazi propaganda died in real time. That night, in Barracks 47, none of the new arrivals slept. They lay in their cots in the dark, and they did not speak for a long time. Hannah Muller lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, and tried to count how many times she had eaten until she was full in the past 3 years. She could think of 4 meals, 4, in 3 years. And now, in a single evening, she had eaten more than at any of those 4 meals, and she could feel her stomach digesting the food, and the feeling was so strange and unfamiliar that she kept reaching down to touch her own belly to make sure it was real. Across the barracks, Wilhelmina Schneider was doing the same thing. Clara Hoffman was lying on her side, knees pulled up, staring at the wooden wall of the barracks and trying to process what had happened. Carla Becker was sitting on the edge of her cot in the dark, her head bowed, trying to construct the logical framework that would explain what she had just experienced. None of them could speak. They had been together as a unit for only a few weeks, but they had become sisters in the way that only women who share certain kinds of experiences can become sisters, and they understood instinctively that nothing they could say to each other would adequately describe the meal they had just eaten. Eventually, around 2 in the morning, an older prisoner who had been at Aliceville for 14 months crossed the barracks and sat down on the empty cot next to Carla. She was an Oberleutnant from the Afrika Korps, captured at El Alamein in 1942. Her name was Friederike. She had been in American custody for 28 months. She spoke quietly so as not to wake the others, though none of them were sleeping. "You are wondering if it was a trick," she said in German. Carla nodded slowly. "It is not a trick," Friederike said. "It is the food. It is just the food. The Americans eat like this every day. The guards eat the same food. The cooks eat the same food. There is so much food in this country that they do not even bother to think about it. There is food in this camp that they throw away every night. Bread that goes stale, vegetables that they consider not fresh enough, pieces of meat with too much fat on them. They throw it into bins in the back of the kitchen and a truck comes in the morning to take it to the pigs. They feed it to the pigs, Carla. They have so much food they feed it to the pigs." Carla stared at the older woman. "But," she said, struggling to formulate the question, "but why? Why are they feeding us this way? Why not just give us enough to live? Why give us so much?" Friederike shrugged. "Because they are required to by their treaties. Because they have so much food, it is easier to feed us the same as their soldiers than to set up a separate system. Because their President Roosevelt believes that hungry prisoners make bad workers, and they want us to work. Because they want their own soldiers in German camps to be treated well, and they understand that this is how that happens, by treating us well first. Because they are Americans, and Americans have strange ideas about how to make enemies into something else. I do not entirely understand it myself. I have stopped trying. I just eat." Carla was silent for a long moment. Then she asked quietly, "Is this what America is, Friederike? All of it? Outside this camp? Is this what the country looks like?" Friederike smiled, a sad smile that had a great deal of irony in it. "Yes," she said, "and it is worse than that. The food is the smallest part. Wait until you see the rest." And with that, Friederike got up, patted Carla on the shoulder, and went back to her own bunk. Carla Becker sat on the edge of her cot in the dark for another hour, and somewhere in that hour, the framework of her entire adult worldview began to come apart at the seams. Hannah Muller, 2 cots away, finally fell asleep just before dawn, and she dreamed of her mother's kitchen in 1938, and of pork dumplings, and of a world before everything had gone wrong. The next morning, breakfast was eggs. Real eggs, scrambled with butter and salt and a little bit of black pepper, served with bacon, toast, oatmeal, a small dish of stewed prunes, a glass of orange juice, and coffee. The Germans ate it in something like a stunned trance. Lunch was a sandwich of sliced ham and yellow cheese on white bread, with a piece of fruit and a glass of milk. Real milk. Cold milk. None of the women under 30 had tasted cold, fresh milk in years. Dinner was meatloaf with gravy, mashed potatoes, peas, white bread, butter, and a slice of chocolate cake. The pattern continued, day after day, week after week, with such consistency that the Germans began to suspect that the Americans had simply not understood that they were supposed to treat prisoners as enemies. Some of the women, especially the older Nazi Party members among them, became suspicious in a different way. They began to whisper that the Americans were softening the prisoners deliberately to recruit them as spies, that the food was a bribe, that the relaxed atmosphere was designed to break their political loyalty. There were committed Nazis in every American POW camp, and at Aliceville they formed an underground organization that policed the other prisoners and punished anyone who showed too much enthusiasm for American food, American music, American culture, or American kindness. A young soldier named Werner Drexler was hanged in a shower stall at Camp Papago Park in Arizona in March 1944 by fellow prisoners who suspected him of cooperating with American interrogators. 7 Germans were eventually executed by the United States for that murder, the largest mass execution carried out by the American military during the entire war. The propaganda war continued inside the camps even as the actual war ground on. But for most of the women, day by day, the food and the treatment slowly worked their effect. The body responds to consistent feeding in ways that the mind cannot resist. Within 2 weeks of her arrival at Aliceville, Hannah Muller had gained 11 pounds. Within a month, she had gained 19. Her cheeks filled out. Her gums stopped bleeding. The split skin on her knuckles healed and the calluses softened. She could climb the stairs to the dining hall without becoming dizzy. She could think clearly for the first time in a year. She began to notice things. She noticed that the American guards, when they spoke to the prisoners, used a tone of voice she had never heard a German officer use with enlisted personnel, a tone that was respectful, almost casual, as though the prisoners were human beings whose dignity was not in question. She noticed that the camp had a library full of books, in German. Books that had been smuggled out of Germany before the war or printed in America by German émigré publishers. She noticed that the camp had a theater group made up of prisoners who performed plays in German on weekends and were applauded by American officers in the audience. She noticed that the camp had a soccer team that played other camp teams on a regulation field with proper goals, and that the Americans drove the team to matches in proper buses. She noticed that the camp had Catholic and Protestant chaplains who held services every Sunday, and that the chaplains were not Americans, but were themselves German priests recruited from immigrant communities in the Midwest. She noticed that prisoners who wanted to study English were given free classes by a retired schoolteacher from Tuscaloosa who came in twice a week and refused payment. She noticed that prisoners who already spoke English were given American newspapers to read every day, with no censorship of war news. The German prisoners at Camp Aliceville in October 1944 knew more about the actual military situation in Europe than the German civilian population in Berlin did because they read it every morning in the Birmingham News over their bacon and eggs. Of all the foods that shocked the German prisoners, 2 stand out in the memoirs and letters they left behind, and both deserve their own moment in this story. The first is ice cream. The second is Coca-Cola. Ice cream, for most of the German prisoners, was a memory from early childhood, from before the rationing began, from before the war made luxury into a vague concept seen only in films. For the younger auxiliaries, it was something they had heard of but never tasted. The Americans served ice cream at Camp Aliceville roughly twice a week as a standard dessert, and on Sundays they served 2 scoops instead of 1. The flavors rotated: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, and on holidays peach or butterscotch. A prisoner named Henriette Wagner, captured in Italy in 1943 and held at the camp at Crossville, Tennessee, wrote in her diary in November 1944 the following passage, which I will translate for you because it captures something essential about what was happening inside these women. I do not know how to write about the ice cream. I am not a poet. I am a sergeant of the auxiliary from a small town near Würzburg, and I have no words for what the ice cream is. It is sweet? Yes. It is cold? Yes. It is creamy? Yes. But these words do not describe it. The ice cream is something that exists outside of war. It is a piece of a world I had forgotten existed. When I eat it, I am a girl again, before my father lost his job, before my older brother went to Poland, before any of the bad things happened. The Americans do not understand what they are giving us when they put this little white scoop on our plates. They think it is dessert. It is not dessert. It is a doorway back into the world we used to live in, before our country went mad. Coca-Cola was a different kind of shock. Coca-Cola had been sold in Germany before the war, manufactured at a bottling plant in Essen, and many of the older prisoners had tasted it as young women in the 1930s. But the war had cut off the supply of syrup, and the German subsidiary had been forced to develop a substitute drink, a fruit-flavored soda that the Germans had named Fanta, from the German word fantasy, meaning imagination, because the company's chief chemist had told his workers to use their imagination about what flavors they could create from the apple pulp and whey that were the only ingredients available. Fanta was acceptable. Fanta was sweet. Fanta was not Coca-Cola. When the German prisoners at American camps were issued Coca-Cola, usually 1 bottle per woman per week, distributed on Saturday afternoons after their work duties were complete, they would carry the bottles back to their barracks like sacred objects. Clara Hoffman, the naval auxiliary, kept the metal cap from her first bottle of Coca-Cola in America for the rest of her life. After her repatriation in 1946, she carried that cap in her wallet for 48 years, until she died in 1994 in a small apartment in Hamburg. Her daughter found it in her wallet when she went through her possessions, and she did not understand what it was until she read her diary. The diary explained that the cap represented the moment she had decided that Hitler had lied to her about everything. The moment she had tasted Coca-Cola again, after 7 years of being told that America was a degenerate, failed nation, and had realized that the drink was not just there for the prisoners, but was available everywhere in America, to anyone, for 5 cents at any drugstore, sold by black uniformed delivery men, driving red trucks that crisscrossed the country day and night, carrying this absurd, delicious, completely unnecessary luxury to a population that took it entirely for granted. Clara wrote in her diary that the Coca-Cola was, for her, what Carla Becker had said about the pamphlet. It was the moment she understood that Germany had picked a fight with a country that was operating on a completely different scale of reality. By the late autumn of 1944, the labor shortage in the United States had become so severe that the American government began contracting out German prisoners to work on civilian farms, in canneries, in lumber mills, and in food processing plants. The pay was 80 cents a day, paid to the prisoners in canteen scrip that they could spend on cigarettes, candy, books, and small luxuries at the camp store. The work was generally light, the hours were regulated, and the prisoners were transported to the work sites by American civilian drivers, often the farmers themselves, who would arrive at the camp gates in pickup trucks and load up groups of 10 or 12 Germans to work their fields. Hannah Muller was assigned to a cotton farm outside Aliceville, owned by a man named Earl Hutchinson, a 58-year-old widower whose 2 sons were both fighting in the Pacific. Earl was, on paper, the worst possible employer for a young German auxiliary. His older son had been wounded at Tarawa. His younger son was in a Marine unit currently fighting on Peleliu. Earl had lost his wife to influenza in 1939 and was, by every social indicator, a man with every reason to hate the German prisoners assigned to his farm. He did not hate them. On Hannah's first morning at the farm, Earl drove her and 4 other Germans to the field, gave them a quick demonstration of how to pick cotton with a long canvas sack slung over their shoulders, and then said something through the camp's translator that Hannah never forgot. "Girls," Earl said, looking at the 5 young Germans, "I am going to be honest with you. I do not like that you are here. I would rather have my own boys here, working this farm with me, but my boys are off fighting your people somewhere on the other side of the world, and we are all of us caught in something none of us made. I am not going to be cruel to you, because that would be a waste of energy. I am not going to be your friend, because we are on opposite sides of a war, but I am going to feed you lunch every day. My sister Marjorie cooks it. It is good food. You will work hard, you will eat well, and at the end of the day, you will go back to your camp. That is the deal. You break the deal, I will have you sent back. You keep the deal, we will get through this together." Any questions? Hannah, through the translator, asked the only question she could think of. Sir, why do you feed us lunch? Earl looked at the girl, who was now 19 years old and had been gaining weight for 3 weeks but was still visibly underweight. Earl looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Because, child, my mother would haunt me from the grave if I let any human being work my land hungry. That is all. Now pick up that sack and let us get to work. Hannah picked cotton for Earl Hutchinson for 6 months. Marjorie's lunches were spectacular. Fried chicken on Mondays, pot roast on Tuesdays, ham and biscuits on Wednesdays, fish on Fridays, with hush puppies and coleslaw. By March 1945, Hannah had gained 31 pounds, spoke functional English, and could discuss the relative merits of Alabama and Mississippi cotton varieties with surprising fluency. She had also, without quite meaning to, fallen halfway in love with the farm itself, with the slow southern rhythm of the work, with the smell of red clay after a rainstorm, with Earl's quiet dignity, with Marjorie's loud laughter and her habit of slipping Hannah an extra biscuit when no one was looking. Hannah was no longer the girl who had been captured outside Aachen. Hannah was no longer a Nazi auxiliary. Hannah was no longer entirely sure what she was. She had a calendar above her bunk on which she marked the days, but she no longer counted them down to anything. She just lived them. By the spring of 1945, the quality of food being served in American POW camps had become a national scandal, but not for the reasons you might expect. American civilians, who were themselves living under rationing of meat, butter, sugar, coffee, and gasoline, began to read newspaper stories about the lavish meals being served to captured Germans. The phrase Fritz Ritz, a play on the famous luxury hotel chain, began to appear in newspaper editorials across the country. Senators received angry letters. Mothers of American soldiers wrote in to demand to know why their sons were eating sea rations in foxholes while German prisoners were eating ice cream and steak in Alabama. A series of investigations was launched. Reporters were sent to the camps. Photographs were published. The photographs showed exactly what the editorials had described: prisoners eating roast beef and apple pie, prisoners drinking coffee from china cups, prisoners watching movies on Saturday nights, prisoners playing soccer on regulation fields, prisoners doing better in every measurable way than millions of American civilians. The Army's response was a careful, patient explanation that what was being depicted was not luxury, but standard military rations applied to prisoners as required by international law. American soldiers, the Army pointed out, were also eating roast beef and apple pie when they were stationed at bases in the continental United States. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed at the same caloric standard as the captor nation's military personnel of equivalent rank. To feed the Germans less would be a war crime. Moreover, the Army explained, the goal was to ensure that German camps treated American POWs well, and the most effective way to encourage that treatment was to set an example. Every American POW eventually liberated from a German camp would owe his survival in part to the meals being served at Aliceville and Herne and Concordia and the hundreds of other American camps spread across the country. The argument did not satisfy everyone. The Fritz Ritz controversy continued through 1945 and into 1946, but the Army held its position. The food kept coming, the prisoners kept eating, and the American military, in the long run, was vindicated by the post-war statistics. The death rate among American POWs in German camps was significantly lower than the death rate among Soviet, French, Yugoslav, or Polish prisoners held by Germany. Not equal to the death rate among Germans in American hands, which was almost zero, but lower than it would have been if the United States had retaliated with mistreatment. The roast beef in Alabama saved American lives in Stalag 3A. The ice cream at Camp Herne saved lives in Oflag 64. The Coca-Cola at Camp Concordia saved lives at every prison camp where an American flyer was being held. The math was brutal, but it was math, and the Army understood it even when the editorial pages did not. When Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, the news reached Camp Aliceville the same way it reached most of the country, by radio. The American guards announced it formally at the morning meal, standing in front of the dining hall and reading a brief statement from the camp commander, a Colonel Robert Knight, who told the prisoners that the war in Europe had ended, that they would all eventually be repatriated, and that until that time, the routines and regulations of the camp would continue exactly as before. The prisoners listened in silence. There was no cheering, no celebration. Most of the Germans had known the war was lost for months. Hannah Muller had known it since she had seen the lights of New York Harbor. Wilhelmina Schneider had known it since 1942. Clara Hoffman had known it from the first time she had eaten ice cream. Carla Becker had known it, intellectually, before she had even been captured. The announcement of the surrender was not new information. It was, however, the moment when the future, which had been suspended for the duration of the war, suddenly began to exist again. And the future was a complicated thing for these women to consider. Most of them did not know if their families had survived. Most of them did not know if their homes were still standing. Most of them did not know if Germany itself was still a country, or what it would become under occupation. Repatriation was not immediate. The American government, working with the new Allied military government in Germany, organized the return of prisoners in stages over the next 18 months. Some prisoners were sent home in late 1945. Most went home in 1946. A few were held until 1947 to provide labor in particularly understaffed agricultural regions of the United States. Hannah Muller was repatriated in August 1946. She had been in American hands for 23 months. She had gained, at her peak, 41 pounds. She spoke fluent English. She had read every German-language book in the Aliceville camp library, some of them twice. She had a savings account, in dollars, holding $217.40, the accumulated wages from her work on Earl Hutchinson's farm, which the camp administration had banked for her at a local bank in Tuscaloosa. The Americans converted her dollars into Reichsmarks before she left, which was a bureaucratic kindness that she later realized had cost her the value of her savings, because the Reichsmark collapsed before she could spend any of it. But the money was not what she was carrying home with her. What she was carrying home was a complete reordering of her understanding of the world. The journey home was a journey backward. The same ports in reverse order, the same ocean crossing, this time on a different ship, the same train rides, this time across a continent that was visibly destroyed rather than visibly thriving. Hannah arrived in Hamburg in early September 1946, and the city she saw was not the city she remembered. The downtown was gone. Whole districts were rubble fields where children played among the broken concrete. The smell of burning was still in the air, more than a year after the last bombs had fallen, because the rubble itself was still smoldering in places where coal had been buried in basements when the buildings collapsed. Food was severely rationed. The official ration for a German civilian in the British zone of occupation in 1946 was approximately 1,000 calories per day, less than what Hannah had been eating, by her own count, at any single meal in Alabama. Hannah took a train south from Hamburg to her village in Bavaria. The train was slow. The train was crowded. The train stopped frequently to wait for repairs. The journey, which had taken 6 hours before the war, now took 31. When Hannah finally arrived at her village, she discovered that her mother had survived. Her father had not. Her older brother had not. Her younger sister had survived, but had married an American soldier of the occupation forces and had emigrated to Cleveland, Ohio, where she lived in a small apartment with her new husband, and where, in 1947, she would have a baby boy who would be named John after his American grandfather. The boy would grow up speaking English and German and would eventually become a professor of history at a small college in Pennsylvania. He would write his doctoral dissertation on the German prisoner of war experience in the American South, and he would interview hundreds of former POWs in the 1970s and 1980s for that dissertation, including his own Aunt Hannah, who would tell him on tape, in a thick accent, the entire story I have just told you. The long aftermath of the German POW experience in America is one of the strangest stories in 20th century history, because it is the story of an enemy population that, having been treated decently in captivity, became one of the most reliable pillars of post-war German-American friendship. Of the roughly 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States during the war, an estimated 5,000 returned to America as legal immigrants in the decade after 1945. Some came back to marry American partners they had met during their work programs. Some came back to take up offers of employment from farmers and businessmen who had been impressed by their work ethic. Some came back simply because they had decided, while sitting in their barracks at Aliceville and Herne and Concordia, that America was the country in which they wanted to live the rest of their lives. Hannah Muller returned to the United States in 1953 on a sponsored immigration visa arranged by Earl Hutchinson, who had written to Hannah in 1951 to offer her a position as farm manager. By that point, Earl's older son had returned from the Pacific with severe wounds and could not do heavy work, and Earl's younger son had been killed at Okinawa in the final months of the war. Earl needed help on the farm, and he had decided that the person he most wanted to help him was the German girl who had picked cotton for him in 1944 and 1945. Hannah accepted the offer. She arrived in Mobile, Alabama, in the autumn of 1953, was met at the dock by Earl Hutchinson in the same pickup truck Earl had been driving in 1944, and was driven back to the farm. Hannah lived on that farm for the next 42 years. She married a local schoolteacher named Thomas in 1956. They had 4 children. Earl Hutchinson died in 1971 and willed the farm to Hannah. Hannah worked the farm until 1995, when she sold it and retired to a small house in town. She died in 2009 at the age of 84, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, all of whom were American citizens, all of whom had grown up hearing stories about ice cream and Coca-Cola, and the night their grandmother first walked into the dining hall at Camp Aliceville and was convinced she was about to be murdered. Wilhelmina Schneider returned to Germany in 1946 and never came back to America, but she carried her experience with her for the rest of her life. She became a school principal in Frankfurt, eventually rising to a senior position in the West German Ministry of Education in the 1960s. She was instrumental in designing the post-war German history curriculum, the curriculum that taught German schoolchildren about the Holocaust, about the war crimes of their fathers, about the moral catastrophe that had been National Socialism. Colleagues who worked with her in the ministry said that she had a quiet but absolute commitment to honesty about the German past, and that when asked where this commitment came from, she would sometimes say simply, "I learned to tell the truth in Alabama." Clara Hoffman, the naval auxiliary, returned to Hamburg and worked for the rest of her life as a longshoreman on the docks. She was a quiet woman. She drank too much. She kept her Coca-Cola cap in her wallet. She married a war widower named Elke in 1949, and they had no children. She read American novels in translation her entire life and could recite long passages of Hemingway from memory. She never visited the United States again, though her husband wanted to, because she said she did not want the country in her memory to be replaced by the country in the present. She died in 1994, 6 months after her husband. Carla Becker, the intelligence officer, returned to Germany and used her English skills to find work as a translator for the Allied occupation government. She eventually became a diplomat. She served as a German ambassador to several countries during the 1970s. She retired in 1982 and wrote a memoir that was published in Germany in 1985 under the title Das Eis in Alabama, which means The Ice in Alabama, a title that referred both to the ice cream and to something colder and harder that had melted inside her during her captivity. The memoir is still in print. It has never been translated into English. Perhaps it should be. If you ask the surviving German POWs or read their letters and diaries or talk to their children and grandchildren, you will find a striking consistency in how they describe what the food meant. The food was not just food. The food was a message. The message was that the country that had captured them was a country that had chosen, deliberately, against every instinct of war and propaganda, to treat its enemies as human beings. The message was that America was a country so confident, so wealthy, so secure in its own identity that it could afford to be decent. The message was that the war Germany had started was a war Germany had lost before the first shot was fired, because Germany had picked a fight with a country whose hidden weapon was a national capacity for ordinary kindness backed by overwhelming material abundance. The message was that the Hitler regime, which had told these women for years that the Americans were degenerate, materialistic, cowardly, and weak, had been lying about every single one of those things. The Americans were materialistic. They were materialistic in the same way a healthy person is materialistic about food. They had so much of it that they shared it with their enemies. The Americans were not weak. They had simply chosen, at the level of national policy, to express their strength through generosity instead of cruelty. This was the lesson that the food carried. And this lesson, once learned, could not be unlearned. There is a passage in Carla Becker's memoir that has stayed with me ever since I first read it. She writes about her last night at Camp Aliceville, the night before she was loaded onto a truck to begin her journey home in 1946. She had been at the camp for 19 months. She knew every guard by name. She had taught English to dozens of her fellow prisoners. She had become, in some unspoken way, one of the senior figures in the prisoner population, a woman other Germans came to for advice. On her last night, the camp commander, Colonel Knight, invited Becker to his office for a private farewell. Knight poured 2 glasses of bourbon, gave one to Becker, and the two sat in silence for a long moment. Then Knight said something that Becker recorded word for word in her memoir, in English, because Knight had spoken in English. "Carla," Knight said, "I want you to remember something. When you go home, people will ask you what America was like. They will want stories of cruelty, because cruelty is what they expect. You will not have those stories. Tell them the truth anyway. Tell them what you ate. Tell them what you saw. Tell them what you learned. The truth is, the only weapon any of us has against the next war, and the next one, and the one after that. If we do not tell the truth about what kindness looked like, the people who come after us will have nothing to build a better world on. So tell them, Carla. Tell them about the ice cream. Tell them about all of it." And Becker, in her memoir, writes that she raised her glass and drank to that, and that she has tried, in every speech she has ever given and every book she has ever written, to honor that promise. This is why this story has been buried for so long. Not because it embarrasses the Germans, though it does. Not because it embarrasses the Americans, though it embarrasses them too. But because it is a story that does not fit any of the narratives we tell about war. It is not a story of victors and vanquished. It is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story of two groups of young women on opposite sides of the largest war in human history who sat down together at a table in Alabama and discovered, through the strange medium of roast beef and ice cream and Coca-Cola, that the people their governments had taught them to hate were not what they had been told. It is a story of how the most powerful country in human history won the peace by treating its enemies the way it wished its own daughters to be treated. It is a story of how an entire generation of German auxiliaries, women who had been raised on Nazi propaganda from the age of 10, were converted into believers in a different kind of country, not by sermons or by political re-education or by trials, but by butter on bread. It is a story that, if we paid more attention to it, might change the way we think about every war we are fighting now, and every war we will fight in the future. The 41 pounds Hannah Mueller gained at Camp Aliceville are gone now. The ice cream she ate is gone. The Coca-Cola has been drunk. The pickup truck Earl Hutchinson drove is rusting in a barn somewhere in West Alabama, if it still exists at all. Carla Becker is dead. Wilhelmina Schneider is dead. Clara Hoffman is dead. The American mess sergeant who carried a crying 19-year-old to a seat in the dining hall in October 1944 is dead, and his name is lost to history, because he never thought what he did was worth recording. The guards who stood at the edges of the room and watched the prisoners weep over their first proper meal in years, those guards are also dead, and most of them never told their children what they had seen. But the story survives. The diaries survive. The letters survive. The memoirs, the academic studies, the oral history projects of the 1970s and 1980s, the dissertations like the one written by Hannah Muller's nephew, all of these survive. They survive because the women who lived this story understood, by the time they died, that what had happened at Camp Aliceville and Camp Hearn and Camp Concordia and the 700 other camps was not a footnote. It was the heart of the lesson the 20th century had to teach. When Wilhelmina Schneider was asked, in a 1985 interview with a German television documentary crew, what she had learned from her time as an American prisoner, she was quiet for a long moment before answering. She was an old woman by then, in her 70s, with thinning white hair and the careful manner of a retired schoolmistress. She looked at the interviewer for what felt like a full minute. Then she said the following words, which have been preserved in the documentary and which were broadcast across West Germany on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. I was taught that Americans were our enemies. I was taught that they would torture me. I was taught that they would starve me. I was taught that they would kill me. I was a prisoner in their country for almost 2 years. They fed me. They treated me like a person. They let me read books. They let me play soccer. They taught me English. They taught me, without ever lecturing me, that everything I had been told about them was a lie. And on the day I was released, the American commander shook my hand and wished me well. I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand what kind of people do that to an enemy. I am not sure I have figured it out, but I have spent every day of my life since 1946 trying to be the kind of person they were to me. I think that is the only proper way to repay what they did, to pass it on, to pass it on, and pass it on, until kindness becomes contagious enough to outweigh the cruelty in the world. That is what the Americans taught me. They did not teach it to me with words. They taught it to me with butter on bread. The fork in Hannah Muller's hand, that first night at Aliceville, was the smallest weapon in the entire Second World War. It was also one of the most powerful, because every time a German prisoner picked up a fork in an American camp and put food into her mouth and discovered that the food was simply food and that no trap was being sprung and no execution was being prepared, the propaganda machine of the Third Reich lost another small battle. Multiply that small battle by 425,000 prisoners. Multiply it by 700 camps. Multiply it by the millions of meals served, the millions of pounds of meat and butter and bread, the rivers of coffee and Coca-Cola, the mountain ranges of ice cream consumed in dining halls from Maine to California. Multiply it by every kind look, every casual nod, every relaxed posture of an American guard who had been ordered not to terrorize his prisoners. Multiply it by every farmer like Earl Hutchinson who fed lunch to a hungry girl from another country because his mother would have haunted him if he had not. Multiply all of this together, and you get a force that no army on earth could have stopped. Not because it was a force of violence, because it was the opposite. Because the food in those camps did, in the end, exactly what the prisoners had been afraid it would do. It fattened them. It filled them up. It made them strong again. And it sent them home, 2 years later, as the seeds of a different Germany, a Germany that would not, this time, become what it had been before. A Germany that would instead become a free country, a prosperous country, a peaceful country, a country whose grandchildren would visit America as tourists and walk through the rebuilt streets of New York and the old streets of Aliceville and would not understand, until someone told them the story, why their grandmothers wept whenever they passed a Dairy Queen or smelled fresh white bread coming out of an oven. That is the story of the American camp kitchens. That is what the Germans were forced to eat. That is what they were forced to learn. And that is why, 3 generations later, the relationship between the United States and Germany is what it is, and why ice cream is sold in every supermarket in Berlin, and why the small leather pouch with a toothbrush and a bar of ivory soap and a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes is, in some quiet way, one of the most underrated weapons in the history of warfare. If this story moved you, if it taught you something you did not know, please hit that like button right now. It helps more than you can imagine. If you want more stories like this, stories of the hidden corners of the Second World War that the textbooks never told you, subscribe to this channel and tap the bell so you do not miss the next one. Leave a comment below and tell me which part of this story surprised you the most. Was it the ice cream? Was it Earl Hutchinson on the cotton farm? Was it Carla Becker's last bourbon with Colonel Knight? Tell me. I read every comment, and if you know someone who would love this story, share it with them. Share it widely. Because Wilhelmina Schneider was right. The only proper way to repay kindness is to pass it on, and to keep passing it on until it becomes contagious enough to outweigh the cruelty in the world. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next video.